Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Journey Through Reality podcast. Today, I'm very kindly joined by Dr. Joshua Matthan Brown, an Orthodox philosopher and priest in training. Joshua, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Ben.
Thank you. So I wanted to invite you on because we sort of linked up privately, and I saw a few of your posts on YouTube, and we sort of had a brief correspondence around sort of divine hiddenness and that kind of stuff, but also around what we've called, I guess, panentheistic idealism. I think you posted something, was it by St. Gregory Palamas or was it St. Gregory of Nyssa? One of the two.
One of them, yeah.
One of them.
I lose track of things I post.
And I said, oh, this sounds a lot like idealism. And you said, yeah, it does. And I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting because for those of you who are familiar with my work on Substack, I am, I guess, what you could call a panentheistic idealist. But I don't know if we potentially mean different things by those words. But sort of before I guess we get to that, I'm really interested to ask you about something called apophatic theology, because you wrote an academic paper a number of years ago, which I think is awesome, and you argued that the apophatic nature of God in the sort of Eastern Orthodox tradition undermines a lot of the contemporary arguments we find in analytic philosophy. And so I wanted to investigate this a bit, but just for the listeners, do you mind defining what apophatic theology actually is? Because I think it's a term that a lot of people are not going to be familiar with.
Yeah, of course. And before I do that, I just want to say you're probably one of the few people on the planet who has read that paper and thought, "Hey, this is awesome." So that's wonderful. I think it's always encouraging for anybody engaged in academics to hear that at least one person took time to read something you wrote, and
well, it's only what's available online, so.
But anyways, yeah, so there's two ways we can talk about God, and historically theologians have kind of made a distinction between the kind of positive things that we can say about God, such as people are more familiar with that, like, oh, God is all powerful and all knowing, those kind of statements, versus the negative kind of statements we can make about God. So the common ones you see are things like God is unlimited, or he's infinite, or he is timeless is another way, or atemporal, you could say that. These kind of predicates are not, they don't have positive content, and that they're not stating some way that God is, but rather they're saying what God is not. And so there's a whole tradition, and it's not just unique to Orthodoxy. This is something you can find in other world religions, and also in the West, in Western Christianity. It exists there too. So this isn't just an Orthodox, uniquely Orthodox way of thinking, but it is definitely central to Orthodoxy's thinking about God. God is such that we can't know what God is. We can't categorize God. God's not a thing that we can place into a box and that we can define. And so when we speak about God's essence, or what God is, we can make a lot of negations. We can say, think of anything in the universe, anything in the world that we can define and think about and form conceptions about. We could negate that when we talk about God. So, anything that's in time or space, anything that has a location, anything that's finite, etc. We could say, well, God's not that. God, we can negate that. and apply that to God. So apophatic theology is kind of concerned with this idea that what God is unknowable. And there's not a uniform approach to this theology. There are different, there's kind of nuanced variations. You can talk about it in terms of like how I just did, just thinking about God's essence, what God is something we can't grasp, we can't know about it. So we can think about it cognitively, or thinking about epistemology, like in terms of our knowledge, or we can even think about it physically. We can say things like, well, God doesn't have a form, or isn't a thing or a substance, those kind of. So there's lots of different ways that it can be cashed out and talked about, but roughly it's the idea that you can't know what God is.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that's really interesting. I guess my next question then is like, why do we think that this is a either legitimate and or preferable way to approach theology or philosophizing about God? Because I can hear, I guess, like a contemporary analytic philosopher might be thinking like, no, we can definitely analyze what God is, and we can definitely speak about this, and the way people like Swinburne and Plantinga define God sort of I guess leads us in that direction. So why think that this is a good approach to theology?
So I guess the first part of the question is maybe just of why should we conceive of God this way? That's a very good question. I think there's two approaches to that question. One would just be the experiential side of things. So in a lot of different world religions, you always have different people who are maybe referred to as mystics or ascetics, people who dedicate a lot of time to either focusing on prayer or, some form of meditation, and trying to, come to know reality as it really is, I guess, and not being clouded by things. This is something common to a lot. And then, of course, in the Christian tradition, especially in Orthodoxy, this is not just looking for some impersonal thing, but this is actually, trying to become aware of ultimate reality, who is God, and who is, for Orthodox perspective, Trinitarian. So there's a personal nature there. But a lot of mystics, their experience of God is of a being who is not a thing, not just another feature of the world or item that we come across, not another person in the sense that you and I are persons. So that's one approach of thinking about it that way. But then there's also a more kind of philosophical approach, and which you might approach it from the traditional way of thinking about an explanation for the world. And so when I say the world, I don't just mean the universe. We tend to think of those as being synonymous, but the world just encompasses anything that actually exists, any finite thing that actually exists. So anything that can be defined, or even better yet, we think about things in the world as needing, contemporary philosophy likes to talk about a set of necessary and sufficient conditions that must obtain in the world for something to exist. So maybe you can call that conditional reality. So the world, that would encompass everything. So yes, the universe, but also, depending on your preference for your ontology, like that could include just material physical things. It could also include things that would not traditionally be considered material, like say you believe in like universal abstract objects, or a distinction between the soul and the body, those kind of things. So the world is kind of bigger than just the universe, but it encompasses everything, every category of thing, and you're wanting to know an explanation for that. Then you could construct some kind of argument that says, well, whatever the explanation of all that is not itself a conditional thing. So it's not something that's existence depends on some necessary and sufficient conditions obtaining in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's prior to the world, so to speak. So you could go that route and try to then say, well, so whatever that is that explains the existence of the world is going to be undefinable. It's going to be something we can't know what it is because it's not a thing. It's not a conditional thing that we can pin down like that. So that's another option, is just kind of philosophically kind of arguing that if God exists, then God is not like a thing in the world, but rather is the explanation for the world. And so as such stands outside the world and is not circumscribed. It's not something that we can identify a set of conditions and say, oh, this is what God is, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So those are two ways. So the first way is a more experiential kind of way where you're trying to seek out ultimate reality, and you kind of come to understand things about ultimate reality. And there's a lot of mystics who, through their experiences, describe it in this apophatic way. But then there's the philosophical kind of metaphysical approach of just trying to think through, well, if there's an explanation for the world and why there is a world, then this explanation would stand outside of the world, and the world is contains all the things that we can grasp and understand and think about, and like things like trees and all those kind of things. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. That's great. I guess my next question then is like, what does this mean about like what we can say or what we can know about God? Because if God is this unconditioned not thing that you say he is, then that kind of leads me to think that like anything we say about God is like like infinitely more incorrect than it is correct. Especially if we like conceive of God as being like ontologically infinite, then it's kind of like any demarcation we make, like any attempt to conceptualize and create I guess like conceptual boundaries around God, like we're like from the off we're kind of like making a mistake. So I guess what are the sort of epistemic implications for theology itself then?
Yeah, no, I mean that's a good question. And I guess the response is kind of like, yes, you're correct. So Pseudo Dionysius, who the Orthodox Church kind of remembers this writer, who we don't really know who it is for sure. So scholars refer to this writer as Pseudo Dionysius, but he's referred to as Saint Dionysius in the Church's tradition. And I'm sure, as a former Orthodox Christian and someone interested in philosophy, that you've probably either read Dionysius or at least are familiar or have heard of him before.
I've never attempted to read him directly, but I am aware of him and his basic
Yeah. So, I mean, he's had a tremendous influence on Orthodox theology, and especially when it comes to thinking about God and the way that we are talking about God right now, this apophatic way. And essentially, that's the conclusion that he arrives at. He basically says after going through great pains to talk about what concepts are fitting for applying to God, he kind of then goes, but actually none of these are really good because, and so, you just keep that in mind that they're not perfect. They don't capture God because God is undefinable. And so we are only capable, his thinking is like, we're only capable of thinking in terms of things, and the concepts that we're used to applying to the objects of our experience are, they're suited to that experience, which is, of almost exclusively of finite circumscribable things that we, like trees and people and things like that. Or even since we're talking about 21st century, where we have all these other abilities to observe things that we couldn't just observe with our senses. So things at a microscopic level or things really far out. All these are things that we can apply concepts to because they're all similar and that they have a nature or essence. Or if you don't like talking about essences, then they have conditions that have to obtain in the world, right? That we for them to exist, and so we can potentially discover what those are, and that helps us understand these things. Whereas with God, we think about the fact that there is an explanation for the world, and we can start trying to apply concepts, but then we have to realize that whatever concepts we're applying aren't going to be, ultimately aren't going to be appropriate. Because, and so, there's a sense in which, according to apophaticism, any concepts for applying to God, they're either going to be they're going to be imperfect symbols. So they're either going to be metaphors or analogies, or we're just going to have to be expressing outright contradictions. And I think that's what you see in Pseudo-Dionysius. I mean, he's kind of saying things like, well, it's appropriate to talk about God as like a substance. That's a category that, in ancient philosophy of kind of like a thing. Like it's completely inappropriate to talk about God as a thing because God's not a thing, because he stands outside of that. So he's just expressing a contradiction because we're at the limits of our knowledge. We can only talk about it in a way that is suitable to our unique nature as human beings and our limitedness.
Yeah. So then I guess my next question is, in terms of, if we get a bit more specific about it, in terms of something like the concept of omnipotence, for example, if we're not saying that this is like a absolute logical category and it's something more akin to like an analogy, what does that mean for how we conceptualize it? Because a lot of the, I guess like a lot of the objections to theism, like divine hiddenness and the problem of evil and this kind of stuff, they rely on very particular notions of what God is and what his attributes are, especially the famous four omnis. And so what does it mean for these objections, if we're saying that, well, these things are basically analogous? Can we just kind of like retreat to mystery, or is there still something that we have to kind of like stand up to with these objections?
That's a really good question. And that just reminds me, there was the second part of your question about how this relates to the contemporary analytic philosophy.
Yes.
Yeah, so in contemporary philosophy, the philosophy of religion, God is not conceived of typically in the way that we've just been talking about, this apophatic way. Rather, God is a conditioned entity. So God's existence, according to those thinking about God in this way, which online and at a more popular level is often referred to as like theistic personalism and I've kind of moved away from using that term just because first of all, the people who hold to this view don't like it. They tend to not like it for whatever reason. And I think, well, that's fine. But also, actually, they have a point. It is confusing because by identifying a view as theistic personalism, that gives the impression at first that you're talking about a view of God that, oh, this takes God to be personal, and these other views are impersonal.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is not really what's being talked about. So that is confusing. So I concede that to those who don't like the label.
The way I like to think about it is kind of like perfect being theology. The idea that like God is this, as you say, conditioned being who just happens to have all the, what do they say, the great making qualities to a maximal degree.
Yes, I think that's a better way. It's less confusing, and that's the more common way of talking about this conception of God. Amongst contemporary philosophers. And so, this view takes God to be a conditioned entity. That means God is within the world. God is another object in the world. But like you said, he's perfect. He's a necessarily existing. Typically, that's the view. Object. And has all these great making properties. And the most important ones often identified are those, like what you mentioned, the omni ones. And for anyone listening who may not be familiar with that, these are like properties like being all powerful, or omnipotent is the word, and or all knowing, or perfectly good. So the whole debate, I guess, in contemporary philosophy of religion about whether or not the conditioned God exists, we might just call this conditional theism, is centered around those necessary and sufficient conditions that we just, so you might think of those as, well, if God exists, he's going to have to necessarily possess at least, let's focus on those big three. He's got to at least be all powerful. He's going to be an invisible person who possesses omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence.
Sure.
So those are those conditions that have to obtain in the world. It has to be the case that there's a invisible person who simultaneously has those three properties. And then the debate is, well, is it logically possible for a person like that to exist? Or is it likely or probable that a person like that exists in the world? And then you have all the debates, all the different types of arguments. And like you've kind of alluded to, a lot of them revolve around these different concepts that we're applying to God. Like, okay, what, is there such thing as an omniscient person? Like, is that logically possible? Let's think about the concept of omnipotence, and then see if that's even coherent, or, and then if you can show, actually, that's completely incoherent. You can't have a omnipotent person, well, that means there's no God, because we've defined God such that if he exists, he has to be omnipotent. And that's just, all of the arguments are very similar. They're, either they're focusing on one of those properties and saying, oh, there's a problem here. This omniscience is a completely incoherent idea. You can't have an omniscient person. Or they try to show a conflict between the two. So, well, maybe you could have an omnipotent person, or you could have an omniscient person, but you couldn't have a person who was both simultaneously omnipotent and omniscient. Like, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And then the other approach, those are those are kind of concerned with just showing it's logically impossible. Like you just can't have a person like that.
Yeah.
There's no possible world in which a person possesses those properties simultaneously. But then I think the stronger forms of the arguments and the ones that are probably the most significant to people who are thinking about this issue at a philosophical kind of level are the ones like the problem of evil or divine hiddenness, like you mentioned. And those are not they're not trying to show that it's logically impossible for there to be such a person. They kind of remain silent on that issue. And they're mainly focused on, well, let's just look at the world. Let's look at certain kind of features of the world and see if it's likely or probable that there is such a person in the world. And so, like with the problem of evil, of course, that's looking at so-called instances of gratuitous or meaningless or purposeless evils in the world.
Yeah.
And just trying to say, well, it seems like, if you have a good God who desires the well-being of creation and who has the power and the knowledge to prevent meaningless, senseless suffering, then such a person would want to organize things in a way to, that there wouldn't be this kind of excess of meaningless suffering. So that makes it, according to this argument, that's improbable or unlikely that such a person exists in the world. And that's, so that's kind of a very quick way of kind of summarizing the whole debate in contemporary. Yeah. And it all centers around that conditional way of thinking of God as a thing in the world that we can talk about God's necessary and sufficient conditions. We can talk about all the concepts we apply to God are the same. Like when I say God's a person, or when I say God has knowledge, I mean it in the same way that you and I are persons and we have knowledge.
Yeah.
I just mean it, but God's knowledge is like off the charts. Like, we have...
It's like super cool, man.
Yeah. Like we have a little bit of knowledge. He's got the maximal amount, that kind of thing. So it's just like a quantitative scale. Yeah. And that's the contemporary debate. But, there is more interest in the apophatic approach to God in analytic philosophy. I've noticed, a bit more discussions and stuff going on, but the minority view amongst Anglophone philosophers interested in these topics. It's not really talked about much.
Yeah, that's a really helpful summary. And I guess, does that mean the apophatic approach to God kind of just like definitionally avoids these problems? Or do you think there's still something to say, like, okay, well, maybe God isn't good in the same way that we mean that word, but it still means something. Like, it still has to mean something, otherwise there's no point using the word. And so we might, even if we can't fully capture exactly what that means, we might still expect a good God to act in particular ways.
Yeah, I don't think, if you embrace like apophatic theism, I don't think it means that you don't have to think about the problem of evil, for example. Like that doesn't mean you're just like, oh, that's not even a problem. I think it does change the nature of what the problem of evil entails for your theism. So, if you think the problem of evil is about this argument that makes it less likely that there's a person in the world that's all powerful, omniscient, and perfectly good, then I think the apophatic theist can say, well, no, the problem of evil it's not to do with whether or not there is such a being as God, because for the reasons we just talked about. Like God isn't a conditional being, God isn't definable. So that kind of argument to disprove the existence of God doesn't really work. But it still presents a problem. I mean, for a theist, in terms of there are lots of instances of intense suffering that seem completely meaningless, like in the grand scheme of things. And so that, first of all, still does, you have to think about it and wrestle with that. Maybe the stakes aren't as high as does God exist in the general sense of like, is there an ultimate explanation of the world? That kind of question. But it does still mean you have to deal with, this idea that God is love and God is good. And, because you're right, the concepts we're applying, even if we take them to be, these are imperfect symbols, or they're negations or whatever, they're analogies. I mean, we're still applying them to God. And we're literally applying them to God, unless it's some kind of metaphor. And sometimes we speak metaphorically of God, like in the Bible, it's very common, God is a rock, but we don't actually think God's a giant rock, like that's a metaphor, those kind of things. But that's not what I'm talking about. So we are actually applying concepts of God that, like Pseudo-Dionysius would say, these are appropriate. We should apply them. But we should also remember that they're like actually kind of wrong because they they don't perfectly capture God.
Yeah.
So anyways, I guess that's a long way of me saying I don't think that being an apophatic theist means that you don't have to do theodicy. That's the whole, I know you're familiar with that term, but anyone listening, theodicy is talking about how we can reconcile our belief that God is good, God is loving, in the face of evil, and things like that. So, I mean, you still have to think through that issue, and talk about it. I just think the discussion, though, is different from, okay, we're talking about whether or not God exists in terms of there's a invisible person in the world who's like the greatest possible being, and we're trying to discover if this person exists or not in the world. It's not a discussion like that, but it is trying to make sense still of how God could be good or loving, and what that means. Yeah,
that's good. And because I wrote an article on Substack recently, basically, almost making this point in the sense that it seems that a lot of the contemporary arguments against the existence of God actually say nothing about theism as such, only about particular conceptions of God or particular sort of broader frameworks in which one's theism exists. So that's really good. But then kind of my last question on this sort of apophatic approach then is, maybe one of the concerns that someone might have, and believe it or not, I've actually heard an Orthodox priest online say this, and so it's not coming from nowhere, I guess. But if God is ontologically infinite, then, like, in what sense is he good? Like, could we not also say he's like omnimalevolent as well as omnibenevolent? Because, I mean, this is an infinite, unconditioned being. So, is that a legitimate criticism that you might fall into, like, absurdities like, well, God actually is just as evil as he is good, or God can sin and this kind of stuff? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah. No, that's a really good one. In fact, have you read Stephen Law's, or at least heard of his, he's a philosopher in England. an atheist philosopher named Stephen Law, and he actually has a challenge. It's called the Evil God Challenge.
Oh, I've heard of it. I haven't read his book, but I've heard of the the Evil God Challenge.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure if maybe that if you had that in mind when you said that or not, but and I haven't studied that argument closely enough to figure out how to categorize it in the way what we were just talking about before, thinking about the different types of arguments for the non-existence of God. But it sounds to me like it falls somewhere in one of those categories in that it's attacking the concept of God.
Yeah, it seems like the logical coherence of
Yeah.
the
So
omnipotent.
it is still in the same ballpark. Like it's a version of, trying to show that this idea of a conditioned being that is, an invisible person who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, like is simultaneously, that it's just somehow incoherent or improbable that such a being. So it seems to fall within that strategy, and that it's trying to say, well, all the reasons you have for believing that God is perfectly, make a similar symmetrical argument, that says that God is perfectly evil, this
Sure.
omnimalevolent kind of thing. And so I guess that's an interesting argument, and it's definitely worth thinking about. And I have actually a friend of mine. She was also one of Yujin Nagasawa's PhD students at Birmingham. That was kind of the focus of her. So she'd be better to talk to because she knows all about that. But even years ago in our discussions with her, just we would have these wonderful little work in progress sessions. I miss those because it was so much fun to sit in a room with 5 or 6 other PhD students who are all sharing, oh, I'm working on this, I'm writing this, and we could just talk about our ideas, and you get to learn about the cool stuff that other people are thinking about. But I remember, in one of those workshops, and we were talking about this, and I think this is fair to say, and Asha, if you're listening to this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that type of the evil God challenge, I don't think it applies or makes any kind of conceptual sense when we're thinking about God as an unconditional entity or as being beyond being, or whatever term you want to use, ontologically infinite. Just because, again, it kind of relies on this concept of God. It only really works if we're thinking of God in this conditional way. And this gets into like a whole bunch of issues too that get really complicated. Like, what do we mean about referring to God as good, or even referring to the world as good? When we talk about something being good today, we tend to lean towards a very utilitarian kind of way of thinking about goodness. Like,
Sure.
that's good because it's useful to me, or it's good because it brings about, pleasure and minimizes pain, or that kind of thing. But so good is kind of this instrumental concept. Like, it's good because it brings about some end that I think is good. But the ancient kind of way of thinking about goodness, especially the goodness of the world, might seem really strange to us today. So there's a lot of like unpacking that would have to be done to really, but like roughly, like the mere fact that something exists, the mere fact that something has a form, or that has being, makes it good.
Okay.
So God being thought of as the kind of the explanation, that which explains the world, we refer to God as the good, because God is the explanation for the world, which is good. The fact that the world exists, that there is a world, is good, in that way of thinking. So then to say that God is some kind of perfectly malevolent entity doesn't actually make any kind of conceptual sense when you're thinking in those terms.
Sure.
It's like there would be no world
Yeah.
because having a world is good. So a perfectly malevolent being would not even bring a world into existence. But that that discussion gets that you're getting into some controversial, complicated territory there.
Sure.
Trying to make sense of different metaphysical systems, different ways of viewing reality, different ways of talking about goodness and evil. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion to be had there. So I guess ultimately what you think about this evil God challenge is going to depend on a whole bunch of philosophical assumptions you have. Whether you think it's a good argument or persuasive is going to depend on all these different things, like what you think about goodness and evil, what you think about what concept of God you're working with, and all these things. So I don't think it's as simple as just saying, "Oh, that's a dumb argument," or or
Yeah.
that's a slam dunk argument. It's more complicated than that. It's like,
Yeah.
what are your background assumptions?
Yeah.
Is that helpful? Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah. No, that's good. And so shifting gears a bit, like I think we've got a good basis on which to say that the apophatic approach to theism is a good one, and there's kind of a inference from like what the nature of God. So shifting gears then, so as I touched on at the beginning, and as we briefly spoke about privately, you said that panentheism is a good way of talking or conceptualizing Orthodox theology. But like with any, I guess, any philosophical concept, it's going to mean different things to different people. And so I guess from your perspective and from the tradition from which you're speaking, what is panentheism, and how does this conception of God sort of work with panentheism?
Yeah, kind of like I think you alluded to this with your introduction to talking about panentheism. There's lots of disagreement about how to understand or define panentheism. So you're not going to find a consensus amongst philosophers even about how we should think about that. But kind of the standard way of generally thinking about it is, you have three sometimes you can think of it in three major views. One is pantheism, which is God is identical to the world, or to the universe, depending on who's talking about it. And so there would be no ontological distinction ultimately between God and the universe on this view. And then on the far other extreme, you have what's sometimes called classical theism. And this would be that God is, ontologically distinct from the universe completely. And supposedly panentheism is supposed to be in the middle. Like, that's how sometimes it's thought about. Like, the universe is, a part of God. Sometimes people think of it that way. But God is more than the universe. So where the pantheist is saying, total there's a total, complete identity here. Like God and the universe are the same thing.
Mhm.
The panentheist is just saying, no, the universe is part of God, but then whatever God is more than that. And the classical theist is supposed to be saying, nope, God is the universe isn't a part of God, and that's how the debate kind of goes. That's the general kind of classification amongst a lot of analytic philosophers. However, the reality is that panentheism has a wider range of interpretations. So not every panentheist thinks of God as the universe as being a part of God.
Mhm.
So, and all of this, by the way, it can get super confusing because a lot of these terms, there's a lot of variation and I think actually just creates a lot of problems, and just having sometimes meaningful discussions and debates about the existence of God, because there's so many variations in how we use certain terms. So, for example, that view of panentheism I just described, that, okay, the universe is a part of God, well, that fits with the conditional type theism. Right? You could think of God as, God has all these great making properties. He's a being within the world. He has, we can define him. And the universe is just a part of God, and the universe and God still exist within the world, this metaphysical space that we call the world. But you can also then think about panentheism slightly differently. You can think of it from an unconditional theistic perspective as well. The world exists in God, so its dependence it depends for its existence on God. But this is not a symmetrical relationship. It's asymmetrical. So the world depends on God for its existence, but God doesn't depend upon the world for anything. That's kind of a difference between the conditional theistic version, which thinks of the world's like a part, or the universe is a part of God. Well, if it's a part of God, then in some sense, God, it's a part of what God is. You could argue that there's this more symmetrical dependence relationship. Like, you can't have God without the universe. So you can already tell there's a lot of nuance here and can get really complicated really fast. But to kind of not keep rattling on about this, recently there's a really interesting series of articles about Orthodox panentheism published in the journal Religious Studies by a friend of mine, a fellow philosopher, Orthodox philosopher named Jeremiah Carey. I highly recommend those articles. But he defends the kind of type of view I'm talking about, the Orthodox panentheistic view, and he kind of cashes it out in terms of the traditional Orthodox way of thinking of God, that distinction between God's essence and his energies, and talking about God's, energies, or to use the St. Maximus's kind of technical language, the logi, these ideas or willings of God, being the formal cause of the world. And so that's if you're looking for a more orthodox, I guess, way of thinking about panentheism, that's a good place to look, to think about an option there. But it's still very complicated because no one's using that term in the same way. So
it's difficult because the way in which I mean panentheism is probably slightly different to how you're using it, and in some sense is synonymous with pantheism. I'm an objective idealist, so basically I think everything exists within like a universal mind or like a universal consciousness. And I'm saying that basically that universal consciousness is something equivalent to what most people call God, although it doesn't have to be conceived in that way if you don't have to. And so in some sense, there's no meaningful distinction between the totality of reality and this thing that we call God, this concept that we're using. But that our reality, what we conceive of as being the physical universe, is, or what I call our sort of phenomenological reality, is transcended by this universal consciousness. So our, like, I guess, yeah, the physical universe is a part of it, but not the totality. But what I hear you saying is something not quite like that. It sounds like you're saying that, well, it's reliant on this kind of essence energies distinction that exists within Orthodox theology. And so it doesn't sound like you're really saying that creation or the universe or whatever is like in God, in like I mean, the way we often think of that word as being like in spatial terms. Obviously, spatial terms aren't really going to apply here. But it's not that the universe is like an aspect of God, like, I don't know, God's pinky finger or whatever. But that there is this, but nonetheless, the God's energies are so imminent to creation that there's this kind of, is it, maybe this is the wrong way to think about it, is it kind of like an emanationist approach, not necessarily in the Platonic sense, but it's kind of like the universe is kind of this like overflow of God's being? Is that like a way of thinking about it?
I kind of I guess the difference being within Orthodox theology, there's this idea that creation is a free act and not just
Sure.
a natural property of God. Oh, if there's God, then there's going to have to be something that He's created.
It's not like a necessary and eternal sort
right.
of overflow or emanation.
But even that gets a little complicated because when we talk about God being atemporal or timeless, and what that means when we talk about a timeless, atemporal entity being the explanation of the world, there's a lot of room there for nuance and kind of discussing. So that's why I say there is, the emanation kind of view is not too far off in some ways, but and there's kind of ways of thinking about it that sound a lot like the emanation, that view, but still retain that kind of idea that the creation is, not eternal in the same sense that God is eternal, but derives its being from God. It depends on God and is the free kind of creation of God. But the the general idea of panentheism and the way that we're talking about it in Orthodox terms, I'd say it probably has a lot more in common with the emanationist view than kind of certainly the kind of causal way of thinking about it that contemporary discussions also frame things like, oh, God is the cause of the Big Bang, that kind of thinking about God.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a lot different from that. But yeah, ultimately when it comes to discussing panentheism, it's the in part, right?
Yeah.
What does it mean to say that the world is in God? And ideally, if you want to make the view something unique from pantheism, and not just like, oh, you're just basically you're just talking about pantheism.
Yeah.
Then there needs to be some kind of coherent picture of what we mean by the world being in God.
Mm-hmm.
I think personally, the work of like modern Russian Orthodox theologians like Sergius Bulgakov
Mm-hmm.
is a really good place. We should do a lot more exploring there because he actually thought a lot about this. He and some others, like his friend Father Pavel Florensky,
Mm-hmm.
they have this idea that there's the divine wisdom or Sophia, which is the inner life of the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
That is kind of like the pattern upon which all of creation is based upon and which depends on.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think this is actually very similar to what Jeremiah Carey is also arguing in his papers that I mentioned. So anyways, there's a lot of actually interesting thought to be done there and work to be done, trying to understand philosophically to be a little bit more precise and trying to explain what we mean by the world existing in God. I think in general terms, that is clearly, to my mind, the Christian view. Because even in the writings of like St. Paul, I mean, it's explicit. He talks about, he quotes the, non-Christian thinkers and philosophers when he's addressing all of the philosophers in Athens in the book of Acts. And he quotes that, in God we live and move and have our being.
Yeah.
And in other spots, he says, he uses that kind of terminology. He describes God as, from whom, through whom, to whom are all things. So this idea that God's the ultimate origin or explanation of the world, and through God we exist. So this idea of being in God or through God and for whom. So the ultimate end or reason or purpose. So I mean, there's a lot of language there. It's again, St. Paul's not doing hardcore philosophical theology. So
Sure. Yeah.
we still want to say, oh, St. Paul, when you say in whom we live and move and have our being, exactly what did you mean by in? We're not going to find that in the Bible because he wasn't talking about that. But we can look at sources that he's influenced by, like Stoicism and Platonism and things like that. And you can start saying, well, clearly St. Paul knew about this stuff and he was borrowing that. And then later Christian thinkers just progressed that. They took that and they even talk more about it. And when you get to someone like Sergius Bulgakov, his whole point is that, we need to talk about this more. This is a theological area that we need to clarify more. And so he tries to do that. Now, of course, that gets him in a little bit of trouble with some people who don't like it whenever, someone tries to tackle
something new.
Yeah, tackle a new problem. It's like, whoa, that's scary. But I think that's a little unfair, because all of the big heroes in Orthodoxy that we like to talk about and celebrate, we're all doing that in their time.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, was it scary that Saint Basil the Great and Saint Gregor of Nyssa had to think of new philosophical categories to try to explain and refine ideas? But it's not scary now because we are like, yay, they're the champions of Orthodoxy, woo. But then when someone like Sergius Bulgakov does it, it's like, oh, I don't know about that guy. He's, anyways, that's my little soapbox.
No, I love it. And I completely agree with you. And just on a completely tangential personal note, one of the things I struggled with in Orthodoxy is this really strong resistance to anything that's basically, even sniffs of something that hasn't been completely exhaustively explained before. But anyway, So how
I just
does
want to tell you that I think you should be frustrated by that.
okay?
Yeah. Because that's, I think, not a very orthodox way. A lot of people who are orthodox do tend to fall into that trap, but it's actually not an orthodox mode.
Hmm. Yeah.
But anyways, continue.
And so how does idealism fit into this? Because you already kind of alluded to Saint Maximus's theology of logoi, and you know, I like to use the analogy that kind of like objects or things are kind of like thoughts or like concepts within God's mind, and obviously we shouldn't push that metaphor too far, but could the same be said for Orthodox theology? Because maybe um, because the way I'm using idealism is in a reductionist sense. So like everything, even what we call the material world, the physical world, can be sort of metaphysically reduced to consciousness or mentation or experience, whatever word you want to use. So maybe you don't mean it in that reductionist sense, but it sort of, I guess, drawing on maybe Maximus in particular, what in what sense is this framework an idealist one?
That's a really good question. And I don't even have, I'll start by saying oh yes, I have a guest with me here. My daughter's woke it up.
Join us on the podcast.
I have not fully developed all my thoughts on this, but I can say that there's a strong kind of ongoing, I'd say persistent tradition in Orthodoxy of precisely what you're saying in terms of God's thoughts are the foundation of reality. Mm-hmm. Whether we think of, there's different, obviously, thinkers who use their own terminology. So someone like St. Maximus, who's using those terms like logos and logi and those kind of things, is essentially, though, thinking of God's willings or, God's thoughts as being the foundation of the existence of things. My contemporary colleague I've been already referred to, Jeremiah Carey, he likes to use the term formal cause. He's borrowing that from Aristotle and from the more scholastic tradition of talking about different explanations of the world. You can have that fourfold division of type of explanations you can appeal to explain the existence of something. Mm-hmm. And so you have the kind of material cause, so to speak, or material explanation. What's it made of, crudely? You have the telos of it, so it's teleological cause, which is what's the purpose of it, what's its meaning or its purpose or its end. You also have the efficient cause, the explanation of what brought it about, what brought this thing about. And then you have the formal cause, which is roughly the structure or the thought or the idea of the thing. So like he likes to use that as a way, so God's thoughts in that sense are kind of like the formal cause of things. So you still have a distinction between the matter and the form there. Mm-hmm. It's just that God's ideas or his thoughts are the form. You have, like I said, I've already mentioned Florensky and Bulgakov. They like to talk about in terms of God's wisdom or divine Sophia. So Sophia, wisdom is plays that role. Mm-hmm. It's the inner life or thought of the Trinity. So there's like those three kind of major streams of thinking about the relationship between God and the world, and all of them though share this basic idea that God's thought or his inner life or his wisdom forms the fundamental basis of reality. Now, that there's a lot more. That's just the general. There's a lot of specifics that someone might want to know. Like, okay, well, exactly what does this relationship look like? And
Yeah.
So that I don't even know exactly what I think about that, because it's still something I am thinking about. And
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could ask a million follow-up questions, but I'm really aware that we have a time limit here. So my final question is, given everything we've just said, and I mean, you've kind of mentioned it in terms of divine sphere being the inner life of the Trinity, how does the Trinity fit into this this kind of metaphysical picture? Because when I think about sort of my broader metaphysics being objective idealism and everything like that, it doesn't seem like there is room for the Trinity in sort of any literal ontological sense. Maybe you can use it in some sort of metaphorical ways. David Bentley Hart talks about the Trinity being something akin to being, consciousness, bliss, this idea that's, I think he's pulling from Hinduism actually. So like I'm kind of on board with that to some sense, although obviously David Bentley Hart is going to push it further in the sort of Orthodox Christian perspective, whereas I might be a bit hesitant to do so. But from your perspective, given everything we've said, where does the Trinity actually fit into this picture?
So, the Trinity is like obviously a central, as you know this very well, central doctrine for Orthodox Christians. I mean, it plays such a fundamental role in Orthodoxy's conception of personhood and love, and a lot of thought about ethics and things like that. So it's very important. Definitely plays an important role in even the understanding of who Christ is. So yeah, major view, very important for Orthodoxy. But how it fits in. So what we've been kind of talking about mostly today is just a general kind of concept of God. Basically, how do we think about the Creator, or the if someone wants to claim there's an ultimate explanation of the world, a creator, how do we talk about God in this sense? And we can talk about God at that level, and then we don't even have to be just uniquely talking about Orthodoxy, or we can be talking about a number of traditions, like various forms of Hindu monotheism, or even in ancient Chinese thinking, like this idea of the Tao and Taoism.
Yeah,
you can find overlap there. You can find it in a lot of indigenous ancient African religious thought before colonization. You're doing really good. For those listening, that little grunt you're hearing is my daughter. So, so you can talk about God that way, and that's kind of a shared concept of God that humanity has developed. One of them that seems to reflect an aspect of humanity's shared experience, or shared just kind of thinking about these issues. But then when you get to the Trinity, that's a very uniquely Christian idea. I guess how it fits is it connects with that idea of God, is that even though Orthodox Christians are Trinitarian, they consider themselves monotheists. And they do that because they would say there's only one divine nature, or essence, whatever God is. There's one God. And since God refers to that which is the explanation of the world, what we're saying is there's only one explanation of the world's existence. And so the thing that does that explaining is one agency. And so the idea of the Trinity is that there's three divine individuals three hypostases, but there is only one divine will, one divine act, one divine, they share a singular divine activity and agency. And that makes it unique from, like, you and I. We might share a human nature together, but we don't share the same will and the same act, of existence. How you get to that is not through any type of, in my opinion, rational logical argument. Like, so there are some philosophers like Richard Swinburne who has tried to make, here's an argument for why God has to be a Trinity. I've never been super impressed by that, because those type of arguments, I don't know that you could. I don't think Christians arrived at their understanding of God as Trinity in that way.
Sure, yeah.
I think to think of God in that way requires looking more at historical theology and biblical exegesis and just the general experience of Christians from the beginning, from the earliest times. And that's where you end up with the doctrine of the Trinity. So that's why it's possible to say, I do believe in God. I don't understand the Trinity. I don't know if I believe that or not. That makes sense to say. You can coherently say that. Sorry, I rambled a bit on that one. So I hope was that what good. You were looking for, or were you wanting to get into more like the specifics of the whole like doctrine of the Trinity and the metaphysical kind of?
Well, I think we've probably run out of time, but I would love to have you back on and just talk about everything sort of in more depth. So maybe we can do that again another time. But I think now is a good time to wrap up, because we're both need to go. So thank you very much for coming on and doing this. It's been very enlightening. It's been very interesting. And yeah, hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Well, you're most welcome. I really enjoyed any opportunity I have to, talk about these topics. I like to take, because, for some weird reason, not everybody around us just wants to sit around and talk about this stuff. I don't know why. It's so cool.
That is a problem, yeah.
But thank you for inviting me. And, I hope that my rambling does not turn away your listeners from your podcast.
No, I think it will be good. I think it'll be good. And where can people find you?
Oh, well, I have my professional kind of site is just on philpeople.com. That's where I upload like preprints of like papers and things I've worked on.
Yep.
But also I have a YouTube channel that I'm very inconsistent with. Sometimes if I have time, I'll put things on there. And usually it's also very random. So sometimes it's more educational stuff about philosophy. Sometimes it's just reading passages from cool stuff that I'm reading, I'm sharing with others. So that's you can find me there. I'm the only Joshua Matthan Brown on the internet. So there's a bazillion Joshua Browns. It's like the most common name. In fact, there's actually 2 other professional philosophers named Joshua Brown.
No, that's inconvenient.
Which is very, remarkable. So if you want to find me, you have to type my middle name, which is Matthan, Matthan. If you search that, you can find stuff about me on the internet.
Well, I'll put everything below. But cool. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Ben.